So my background's in recruitment, specifically Unity development in Stockholm. And a lot of the studios there had a consensus culture. And
Mhm.
I managed to feel this firsthand because I was on the monthly check-in calls with our contractors. And the biggest challenge that came up, it tended to be sometimes that consensus culture just meant things were just super slow. Like if someone had an idea, if someone disagreed, then until everyone agreed in some studios, it just could have been a 2 day fix from the contractor and me perspective, but it ended up being like a 1 3 month fix. So you mentioned that is not ideal, but like how do we avoid that from happening? Because you mentioned, hey, I'm the leader, I'll be making the decisions, but is there something else that isn't happening that is resulting in this consensus culture?
Two things, and before that, of course, Sweden is notoriously famous for that, right? So I think that's an extreme case. And obviously, if you are in Sweden, you can't ignore that culture 100%. Impossible, right? It's so ingrained in their society, so you have to deal with it. But to answer your question, culture, right? It is on the one hand side, how do you want to communicate in your studio? For example, at RCP itself, we not only have a purpose statement, which everybody knows, and I repeat on a regular basis, but we also have four core values, which are very often communicated. It's a non-aggressive attitude, it's fellowship, it's a sustainable action, and what we call professional nerdism, right? And then we have like 150 principles where we describe, small things, how we advise people to do things. And especially those principles are not only coming from me, right? The values are mostly driven by me. I'm the CEO. I think, purpose, values, that's a top leadership thing, right? It's not you should involve people to discuss, but it's definitely something you need to decide. The principles are different, right? More people are actually contributing to this. So you ultimately build some kind of framework, even documented, how you want your culture to be. Obviously, the magic lies into, are you then also living it? If I would violate those principles and values on a recurring basis, that's not going to work. So it is hard daily grind to stay in that lane as much as possible. And yes, I do sometimes violate my own values. If that happens and I realize it, first of all, I want my people to call me out. And second of all, and I have to admit, I normally know it by on my own already, then I give context why I did it. Or in some cases, if it happens after the fact, then I say, okay, that's a special situation. Here's the context, here's the rationale, blah, 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 blah. That people basically can understand why this is happening. So you talk about consensus. Another thing is that we are big fans of establishing our own communication style. I mentioned radical candor, right? You join RCP, radical candor will be on your table the day you start.
That's so good. I hired my brother, and I was advised to read Radical Candor to work with my brother. So we read that book together while driving to the coffee shop to work, and that's helped a lot. Basically, anytime my brother was like, "I don't like the way you're saying this," it's like radical candor moment. I'm like, "Oh, okay." It worked like really well because it's one. It gives you permission. Weirdly, to be honest, when like, why isn't that not the default? But the book is really good at giving you the context as to why it's important.
And this is in one of our teams at peak, we had 28 different nationalities. So how on planet Earth would I think that all of those share the same culture? We just talked about Sweden, right? That's nonsense, right? And a book like this established terminology. Everybody knows what challenging means, care personally. It's kind of establishing that. So understanding. A lot of triggers and conflicts arouse through kind of misunderstandings, right? People understand words differently, semantics, all that. I think that's so avoidable, right? Or at least it should be the goal for you to avoid it as much as possible. So the terminology, and on the other hand, there's so many examples in there where we did workshops where we had people do this in front of each other and so on. Yes, sure. And for some of them, it was incredibly uncomfortable at first, but when they, psychological safety again, when this builds up, and I'm also at sometimes kind of radical candidate myself in the company in front of everybody, right? So they see, I apply this to myself too. Or that, in the very early days of my career, I'm not proud of it, but a lot of people felt that I was intimidating. I'm an active listener, I'm demanding, la la la. It was intimidating, right? And so many years ago, I started, especially with the younglings, right? What we call a Padawan club, where we read books, where I lead this group, where I share tons of things, also personal things. So it was so funny. At one point in time, one of those younglings in a bit of setting is challenging me in front of the company, right? Some of the others are like getting pale and thinking that now Hendrik is going to crucify that person, right? And the opposite happened, right? I actually thanked them and said, this is a great example of the future of the company. And these sometimes are the smaller things, the symbolic things. They might, from a kind of objective, rational perspective, not be important, but they are incredibly important to build your culture.
Yeah, I love that leading by example there, where you just got rid of the assumption by showing, oh, this is what would happen.
Or, I obviously don't really have much hair. I sometimes make jokes about it myself, right? And then everybody gets, this dude can be serious, but he's not all serious, right?
Yeah, there you go. Sweet.